things that's unique about today for us is that I'm the only one who was here last month. I mean, other people were here last month, but the three of you weren't. And so I'd like to backtrack just a little bit and mention some of the things we talked about last month and give you and I'd also like this to be interactive once I kind of set the stage. Last month we talked about the first 20 verses of Thomas and more about the distinction between what I call and other people call vertical spirituality and a horizontal spirituality. Most of traditional Christianity has been a vertical spirituality. And there's nothing wrong with that. It served me well for a long time, and there's still parts of it that serve me well. But the notion was essentially, a metaphor often used was that of climbing a ladder. And if you've ever tried to climb a ladder, or for that matter, a staircase, even coming in here, you can't get away from that. The more you carry with you while you do it, the harder it is to do, because what you're carrying with you weighs you down. That is a very traditional view of the spiritual journey. So the goal becomes to strip yourself of things. So you strip yourself of behaviors that aren't appropriate. Sometimes you believe those behaviors aren't appropriate, and other times people have told you which behaviors are not appropriate. You do things that are known as ascetical practices. You fast. You might do penance. And that is to rid yourself of the weight of things that aren't helpful as you climb that ladder. And the end of the metaphor is that if you finally strip yourself of enough, you'll be able to get to the top of the ladder and reach God. Horizontal spirituality, on the other hand, is much more typical of Eastern religions and says that everything is appropriate for somebody, with rare exceptions, and that it is in moving through the experiences of life without clinging to them that you get to God. That divinity isn't just up there, but is in fact all around us. And you see shades of that in traditional Christianity too. The whole notion of Jesus being incarnate of God, it was seen as a statement, a very powerful statement, that everything is part of God. The creation myths in Genesis talk about that, how God creates everything that is. But somehow, we went from this notion that divinity was all around us, including within us, to it was up there somewhere, and how much could we take off while still retaining modest enough clothing so as not to offend people and still climb the ladder. The Gospel of Thomas in particular, but the Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels in general, are horizontal spirituality Gospels for the most part. There was, as this sheet that was separated at the back, and I probably will give you one today, because I like that. My wife never gets what I ask. I'll give some background. It's actually from the preface to a book called The Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagels. Did I give you one? Yeah, okay. And there's examples here of the different Gnostic Gospels. And she talks about Gnosticism, and I want to be clear that I don't identify as a Gnostic. There are people who identify as Gnostics. And that term is probably about as misused as any other powerful word in spirituality. Some Gnostic sects did think you had to have special knowledge to get to God. Other Gnostic sects believed that it was insight that allowed you to see God. And Thomas, the sect of Thomas, was certainly one of those. There's groups that think that during the period between the time when Jesus was 12 and in the temple, found in the temple as he was journeying with his family, and the time that he appears on the scene to be baptized by John the Baptist, that he did all sorts of world traveling. That he was as far away as Tibet, learning Tibetan Buddhism, and the only real problem with that is that Buddhism didn't reach Tibet until several hundred years after Jesus died. So that isn't too likely. But they think he might have gone off to India. And, there's this reality where Jesus, growing up in Nazareth, sat along what was the Silk trading route. And so it's entirely possible that he was exposed to different ways of expressing things, different styles of teaching, different understandings of divinity. And that may be what influences the Gospel of Thomas. Thomas is also traditionally said to have gone to India, or at least Thomas's disciples did, and established some early Christian outposts there. So the Gospel of Thomas becomes a collection of sayings. It's not like the Gospels we're familiar with. That said Jesus went here, and he did this, and then he did this, and oh yeah, along the way he said this and said that. The Gospel of Thomas, which may, depending on who you believe, predate all of our Gospels that made the cut, so to speak, into the canonical Bible. It may have been written as early as in the 40s. If that's true, it predates even Paul's letters. And it is symbolic and emblematic of this diversity that existed in the first 300 years of Christianity, especially the first 200. There are today some 38,000 Protestant denominations in the world. But if I remember the statistics correctly, every week 4 more are started and 3 collapse. So it's still a growing, splintering movement. But the diversity in early Christianity was most likely even broader than the 38,000 some Protestant forms of Christianity that we have today. Today, most churches that are institutional churches will tell you that they believe, most of them, in the Trinity, most of them that Jesus was the biological Son of God, and most of them hold to the canonical Bible as being not only the only appropriate Bible, but that it's closed and God doesn't communicate anymore. Early Christianity didn't even have those basic points of agreement. And it was only when Christianity starts to become recognized as the official religion of the empire that now the people in charge say, holy cow, we got to control who's in and out. And so we start making rules. And if you don't believe the right thing, if you're lucky, you get kicked out. If you're not so lucky, you get killed. And so, of course, with those being mistakes, people fall into line pretty quickly. And a lot of this early diversity is lost until about the mid part of the last century, when there were 2 really important discoveries. The lesser really being the scrolls of Qumran out in the desert in what is now southeastern Israel, which had a number of scrolls were found in sealed jars by a little boy pitching stones into caves, and he heard it hit something. Those are largely Old Testament scrolls. But they were still very helpful because they corrected our understanding of the Hebrew Scriptures. In the area around Egypt, the Nag Hammadi codexes were found. In them were earlier copies of the Gospels than we had, earlier copies of some Hebrew books than we had, and earlier copies, and for sometimes in some cases, the first copies of these Gnostic Gospels. The theory was that when they were outlawed, about 200, these monks who were down in Alexandria and down through Egypt said, we're going to hide these, because they valued them and they knew they would be burned if they were found. Well, they hid them so well, it only took about 1,700 years for us to find them. And from that comes the Gospel of Thomas. And what I'm planning on doing is extending, as we started part 1 last month, and it's available on YouTube if you want to see it. If you look for my first initial and last name, C. Bergland, on YouTube, you'll find last month's Thomas presentation. Next month, we're going to do about another 20 verses. In April, we'll take time off and talk about resurrection, because it just seems appropriate because Easter's there. And then in May, we'll pick it back up. In your bulletin, it says to be determined, but that's because my brain wasn't working so well last night when I typed things up. And what I'd like really to do is just look at a couple of these and suggest to you and get your feedback on what you think they mean. You know, some of these I'm sure ring a bell. Certainly, even that phrase, anyone with 2 good ears had better listen, rings with echoes of the Gospels we're used to. Let those who have ears listen. The sliver in your friend's eye and the timber in your own is a sliver in your brother's eye and a plank in your own. So the interesting thing about that is that it indicates that these people did not just come out of nowhere. They were familiar and conversant with the tradition that survived to us. But in verse 22, that second big paragraph on the Jesus saw some babies nursing. He said to his disciples, these nursing babies are like those who enter the kingdom. They said to him, then shall we enter the kingdom as babies? This isn't even unlike Nicodemus and John. But then he says, when you make the two into one, and you make the inner like the outer, and the outer like the inner, and the upper like the lower, and when you make male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male, nor the female be female, we're still kind of there. We're still hearing a little bit that thing that we're used to about him turning the social order upside down. The first will be last, the last will be first. But then, when you make eyes in place of an eye, a hand in place of a hand, a foot in place of a foot, and an image in place of an image, then you enter the kingdom. Are you familiar with the Japanese koans at all? What is the sound of one hand clapping? It's a question without a rational answer. And the purpose is to jolt you out of your rational mind. Hopefully not permanent. But at least for a while, to get you beyond what you're thinking into a place of feeling. Imagine your face before you were born. It's one of those things to jolt us out of that. I don't know what this means. But maybe what if that's the point? What if we're used to hot and cold, up and down, on and off? And he's trying to push us out of that either or mentality into a both and mentality. There's certainly, for example, nothing about getting naked. It's on the top of the third page. It's, I guess, the second part of 37. After his disciples said, when will you appear to us and when will we see you? And he says, when you strip without being ashamed and take your clothes and put them under your feet like the little children and trample them, then you will see the Son of the living one and you will not be afraid. There was nothing more humility and more embarrassing, rather, in Jewish culture than to be seen naked. That's why they crucified people naked. Despite the fact that our artists put a little loincloth on Jesus to clean him up a little bit. So surely he's not telling them to take their clothes off. But could he be speaking about pride, attachment, ego? Children are certainly born naked, and our granddaughter likes to run around naked at age 3. But is it that children aren't embarrassed about who they are? Is it about that a barrier to spirituality is our pride? Is our worrying about things like what people think of us, how we appear, what we look like? Now, the either or mentality tends to push that one way or the other. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Dream Team with Michael Keaton and Peter Boyle. About Michael Keaton works in a psychiatric hospital in New York, and he decides to take the patients to a Mets game, and the van breaks down. And Peter Boyle plays a schizophrenic who's obsessed with God, as many schizophrenic folks are. He walks into a Pentecostal church, starts talking about God, but whenever he talks about God, he takes his clothes off. So the reaction of the church as he starts getting naked is rather funny. I don't think this is about playing Peter Boyle. But it is about our comfort level. I think it's also about reality right under there in 38. Often you have desired to hear these sayings, that I am speaking to you, and you have no one else from whom to hear them. There will be days when you will seek me and you will not find me. I've had that experience. Are there not times of spiritual emptiness? When we can't seem to find comfort or solace or what we're looking for at all? 42 says, Jesus says, be passers-by. That's what I said the first time I heard it.
Oh. Maybe it needs to become a part of it?
I think it's about attachment.
Stay free?
I think it's about horizontal spirituality. Can you let things go? Not passersby in the sense of the people who didn't stop to help in the Good Samaritan story. Somebody posted this long thing on Facebook today about if you just aren't attached, it won't matter to you who wins the Super Bowl tonight. She obviously doesn't understand what it is to despise the New England Patriots as much as I do. There are some things that she's right. I mean, we should let go. But there are those things that we hold on to that really cause us a lot of grief. We should on ourselves a whole lot. I should have done this. I should have done that. If only I'd done this. Look at where my life is. Joseph Campbell, who studied myth and mythology and did some stuff on PBS about myth, said that unless you let, and I'm paraphrasing, unless you let go of the life that you expected you would have, you will never live the life you've actually been handed. I think that's what it is to be a passerby. I thought interestingly too, and I know I'm going backwards, in 29, Jesus said, if the flesh came into being because of spirit, that is a marvel. But if spirit came into being because of the body, that is a marvel of marvels. Yet I marvel at how this great wealth has come to dwell in this poverty. And I would just say, it seems to me, if flesh came into being because of spirit, well, that could be a look at creation, incarnational sorts of things. Spirit coming into being because of body, might that not be awakening in this body? Might that not be a kind of enlightenment and understanding that he's pointing us towards? And might there not be a little sarcasm, and I marvel at how this great wealth has come to dwell in this poverty. If we're trying to let go of things, the more we have, the harder it is to let go. It's actually perhaps the root of all these sayings about being poor is a wonderful positive thing that we kind of look at and go, are you insane? But maybe it is about letting go. Maybe the reason it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich person is that a rich person is carrying a lot of stuff with him, like the person with his wagon in the allegory from the Golden Castle, which I keep being amazed. We just work through the book, and it always seems like they match whatever it is we're talking about. But you can't get your wagon through the eye of a needle, and so you have to let it go. Maybe the biggest spiritual obstacle for these Thomasine Christians who had this as their primary source early on was non-attachment, horizontal spirituality, becoming passers-by. Ponder this. If you look, and then I'll conclude, I'll wrap up. I feel like Pentecostal, I'm telling you I'm going to finish. I have Pentecostal friends, so I'm not knocking that at all. But you look at the beginning of Jewish history, and they say, oh, one day we're going to get a king, and the king's going to be great. We're going to have this king, and he's going to be the right king. And they suffer through a lot of not-so-right king, a couple of not-so-right kings, and they come to King David, and it's the heyday. And then Solomon was half a heyday with a lot of cash, and then after that it was a bunch of pretty despicable people. And they said, oh man, whoever's going to come and be the Messiah is going to bring us back to the glory days. It's going to be a new King David. And so Jesus pops up. And a lot of them say, wait a minute, this guy's supposed to reestablish this military kingdom and financial success. Sounds a lot like some people on TV nowadays. And he's not doing that, he can't be the one. And yet Jesus is saying, no, it's not about that, it's about something else. And people decide, oh, he's finally going to help us keep our religious laws. And so the metaphor of the time, it made perfect sense to them. It was about salvation from the fact that they couldn't perfectly keep the 612 or 613, if you were a man, tenets of the Jewish law. And then you get to the early Christian days, and all of a sudden he's died, he's resurrected, and they're saying, oh, he's going to come back any day now. And any day now comes and goes, and comes and goes, and comes and goes. And despite that there's people still around today saying he's going to be here, it's going to be now, this is the day. Might it not be that we all interpret our experience of divinity through the lens of who we are, the time in history that we're born, the culture that we're born into, and the lenses that we wear because of those things? And so, any of those earlier models are perfectly fine if they work for somebody. But I know for me, the longer I live, the less I'm willing to believe, for example, that a baby is born stained with original sin, inherently defective, and doomed to dance under a very low pole for the rest of its life should it die before baptism. The more I see people, the less convinced I am that any of them are evil. We're all broken in some way, and sometimes we respond out of that brokenness in a way that's less than ideal. But for me, I have a hard time envisioning anything like a divinity that would say, well, I'm going to burn you forever for that, have a nice day. And so, when I see things like Thomas, I see things that resonate for me. Now, you can see those things too in the canonical Gospels if you just look for them. You can see in places like the writings of Paul, for example, that a lot of the things we get hung up on, he wasn't even aware of. He wasn't aware of a virgin birth tradition. He wasn't aware of a lot of the things that appear in the Gospels because he wrote earlier and traditions developed. So I could knock on your door and say, offer to save you from sins. And you'd probably slam your door in my face. Or I could say, you know, you're inherently all right already. That's the message. And what Jesus really came to do, according to Thomas and some of the other Gnostic Gospels, is show us how to work our way through the brokenness and the trials and the things that life brings in our way. Show us how to let go. Show us how to look at things in a new way. And for me, that doesn't make Jesus any less unique, any less divine, any less worthy of my reverence and my accolades, whether or not I see him as being a biological son of God. And the interesting thing is that through these Gospels, Jesus continually says, through these Gnostic Gospels, Jesus continually says to his followers, you can be me. And isn't it interesting that in John's Gospel, as he's saying goodbye to his followers, he says, I no longer am your master, but I'm your friend, because that's what we are. But you don't hear a lot of sermons about that. Being equal to Jesus. And yet in John, Jesus says, you'll do the things I did and more. Better than Jesus? You better start firing at the stake. Does any of this resonate? Scary? Out there?
Logical. In my mind, it makes more sense. To me personally.
Mm-hmm. What are you, a skeptic?
It's hard to let go of the traditions that we've grown up in. Those of us that have, grown up in households where, it is one strict following, and, you grew up into that, and then to feel that something's not right, to, personally, and then to try to let that go. It's still in your head, the things that you heard when you were a kid.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
Well, there's that very, very real phenomenon that somebody who I don't see as often as I used to taught me, who was a retired social worker. It's called regression in service of the ego. And that is that when we get in trouble, we go back to those things which brought us comfort in the past. So, a lapsed Roman Catholic will go back to the rosary when it hits the fan. we'll go back to praying in a certain way. We'll want to hear those old church songs that we haven't heard in a long time. And that's a normal way of coping and adapting. So I think a lot of that stuff we were raised with, even if we move beyond it, or around it, or past it, or whatever metaphor you want to use, still is actually very serviceable for us. I've known people who've been chaplains in nursing homes, and in traditions where they use incense, and they've gone and found Greek Orthodox incense thuribles, which have bells and whistles and all kinds of things hanging from them. And they'll take them in, and those sounds and those, even the smell, even with people who are in advanced Alzheimer's, it resonates with them. So there's some of those foundational seeds that really serve us throughout life, even if we don't hang out in those places anymore, and our spirituality is taking us somewhere else. Which I think is great comfort, because then you can't say, well, I wasted my time. Everything goes to getting us where we are.
I have a comment.
Please.
On your thoughts about are people born evil? You know, I don't think people are born evil. I think maybe that's the word that was used at the time. But I think that people are born egocentric and selfish and greedy. And I think you see that, first of all, when children get to that point where they don't want to share their toys. You know, it's like, I want what I want, and then I want to do what I want to do, and so it's up to the parent to teach them, how, the baby wants to do, pull the stuff out of the garbage, and, you have to teach them the difference between yes and no, and right and wrong, and the whole sharing the toys thing, thinking about other people's feelings, and I think that is what people are born with, because if we were all born good, then why are we in the situation where we are now? Why do people have to learn? So I think somewhere, I don't know if evil is the word, but I think there is that deficit that we are always trying to become a better person against something that's in our inner nature. Anyhow, that's my thought.
Yeah. I've heard somebody, and I wish I could remember who it was, once described original sin, a contemporary view of it, as being that tendency we all have to get ahead at the expense of others. So I want my toy. Can't have my toy because that's mine, and that's mine, and your toy is mine too, because that looks pretty fun. And then, as the more sophisticated we get, the more nuanced and sophisticated that becomes. I'll talk you down to the boss behind your back. I'll take advantage of you in a way that I'll get you to do something for me that I need done, and I'll make you think that I'm going to give you something in return, but not really. I just need this done so I can move on. I would agree completely. There's that. I think it is ego. I think that's a great obstacle to the spiritual path. None of us can realistically obliterate ego completely. And there's times that it probably serves us well. If you're in the middle of the street and the car's coming, you're not going to stand there and say, well, that person may really need to run me over. Maybe I'll just stay here. I mean, we'll get out of the street, but...
Is that what I was thinking when I was looking?
That's right.
Run me over?